The money came in, so why does your life still feel exactly the same? That is the part no one really prepares you for. You can work, get paid, cover your responsibilities, and still reach the end of the month with the private feeling that nothing is actually moving. Nothing is collapsing, but nothing is becoming more solid either. And that is when getting paid stops feeling like progress. It starts feeling like fuel for a life that never seems to go anywhere. You notice it in a way that is almost embarrassing to admit. Not when the paycheck lands. Later, when the month is nearly over and your life feels no more built than it did at the beginning. You worked, you handled what had to be handled, you stayed careful, you stayed responsible, you kept everything from slipping, and still, beneath all of that effort, there is this quiet, stubborn feeling that your life is not actually moving. That is what makes this kind of pressure so disorienting. From the outside, it does not look like failure. It looks like adulthood. You're showing up, covering what matters, staying on top of things, doing exactly what a functional adult is supposed to do. But inside all of that discipline, something never arrives. Not momentum, not ease, not that private internal proof that all this work is turning into a life that feels more stable, more open, more yours. People talk about money as if the whole problem lives in the numbers. The numbers matter, of course they do, but the deeper damage begins when hard work stops producing any felt sense of forward motion. Another month passes, yet you do not feel further inside your own life. You stay occupied, but not closer. You keep everything running, but keeping something running is not the same as building somewhere you can finally rest. Once you feel that difference clearly, it becomes impossible to ignore, because surviving and building do not feel the same inside a person. Surviving feels like correction, containment, constant small defenses. It feels like living inside low-level adjustment, where every choice is partly about stopping something else from getting worse. Building feels different. Building feels like your time is leaving something behind, like your effort is making space, like your sacrifices are becoming stronger ground under your feet. A lot of people now are doing the first thing while being told they should feel the second. That is why getting paid can feel so strangely flat. Not because the money doesn't matter, it matters a great deal, but mattering is not the same as feeling like progress. You can need every dollar and still feel no real sense of movement when it arrives. Because if that money is only keeping the same fragile structure standing one more month, then what you're experiencing is not advancement, it is continuation. And continuation is hard to celebrate when what you're craving is evidence. Evidence that your work is making daily life more solid. Evidence that your discipline is making ordinary existence less tense. Evidence that all this adult effort is becoming something more than permission to repeat the cycle again next month. That is where the frustration turns into something heavier. At first, it sounds small. You got paid and it did not feel satisfying. But that's not really the issue. The real issue is what happens when that pattern repeats for long enough. Work stops feeling like a path and starts feeling like a loop. Necessary, yes. Serious, yes, but emotionally flat. Important, but unable to produce the feeling adulthood was supposed to give back. You start seeing it in ordinary moments. A chair at home stays broken just a little longer because replacing it is somehow never the right priority. A worn-out pair of shoes survives another month because something less visible matters more. A basic plan has to be mentally negotiated against 3 other invisible pressures. One small increase in a bill quietly erases what could have been a little room. A normal purchase turns into a debate, not because it's reckless, but because there is always something in the background pulling harder. Then the pressure gets even stranger. You begin organizing your life around what cannot go wrong, not what would improve it, not what would move it forward, just what cannot break right now. That changes the emotional meaning of almost every ordinary decision. A weekend plan is no longer just a weekend plan. A repair is no longer just a repair. Something basic your child needs, a message inviting you somewhere, A household item finally wearing out, an extra pharmacy run, a school expense you forgot was coming, all of it enters the same internal courtroom. Not, do I want this? Not even, can I afford this? But what does this choice threaten if I say yes to it? That is not freedom. That is a life being managed under invisible pressure. And the hardest part is that most of the time, no one can see it. There is no dramatic collapse to point to, no single event people can use to understand why you feel so mentally pinned down. Your life may even look organized. Bills are getting handled, work is still happening, responsibilities are still being carried. You may sound fine when someone asks how things are going, but under that surface is a life held together through constant silent negotiation, constant trade-offs, constant decisions about what can wait, what cannot, what gets reduced, what gets swallowed quietly because it's too small to call a crisis and too heavy to ignore. That's the hidden exhaustion of normal life when there is no margin. Nothing is exploding. Everything is being manually stabilized. After a while, that starts touching something deeper than stress. It starts touching identity. Because now the pressure is no longer only about what you can afford. It's about what your effort says about your life. Why does being responsible still feel so unstable? Why does working this much still not create stronger footing? Why does adult competence seem to buy temporary control instead of real security? Why is time moving so clearly while your internal sense of advancement barely moves with it? Those questions hurt because they strike the place where people store their idea of themselves. A person can carry a lot of weight if they believe it is taking them somewhere. What wears them down more deeply is the suspicion that it isn't. They start to wonder whether they are building something at all or just keeping the present from getting worse. Discipline no longer feels like growth. It feels like containment. Even effort begins to lose its dignity because it is no longer opening life up. It is only keeping pressure under control. That's the point where the cost stops being purely financial, because once effort stops feeling like a bridge to something, it starts feeling like repetition, and repetition does strange things to the mind. It makes motivation quieter, it makes hope less convincing, it makes the future harder to picture with real confidence. You still show up, you still do what needs to be done, you still care. But part of you starts pulling back emotionally because it no longer trusts the cycle to return anything except another month of managed strain. Then time enters the problem in a different way, not as a schedule, as evidence. You begin to notice how long you've been living like this, how many months were spent covering, adjusting, reducing, protecting, how many small desires were quietly talked down because they could not survive contact with the rest of the month, how many seasons passed without the internal sense that your world was becoming more buildable. And that's when the fear gets sharper, because now the issue is not only that life feels stalled, it's that your effort no longer feels capable of changing that. That is a much deeper injury than people realize. Work is supposed to mean something emotionally, not just financially. It is supposed to create at least some sense that your labor is producing ground beneath your feet, that your adulthood is becoming more inhabitable, that your sacrifices are becoming some version of safety, breathing room, or peace. When that never quite happens, the loss is not only in your bank account. The loss is in your relationship to the future. The loss is in your ability to feel that time and effort are cooperating with each other at all. That is why some people feel almost numb on payday. Not because they're ungrateful, because they've lived too long inside a pattern where money arrives, responsibility absorbs it, and life remains emotionally in the same place. That creates a very particular kind of humiliation, not the humiliation of obvious failure, the humiliation of doing the right things and still not being able to feel your world deepen, of being responsible enough to keep everything running, but never relaxed enough to trust what you built, of looking functional from the outside while privately wondering why adulthood feels less like progress and more like permanent upkeep. That feeling spreads. It changes the way you answer simple questions about how you're doing. It changes how quickly you shut down small desires. It changes how safe it feels to want anything beyond maintenance. It changes relationships too, because pressure like this affects how present, generous, and mentally available a person can be. Eventually, it starts reshaping the way you see yourself, because sooner or later, you begin asking whether the problem is your decisions, your discipline, your expectations, your patience. That is where the false pressure enters. The pressure to turn structural exhaustion into personal failure. The pressure to treat delayed progress as a moral flaw. The pressure to act as if being worn down by repetition means you're immature, when repetition without meaningful return would wear down anyone. That is the lie worth rejecting, because the truth is harsher and cleaner than self-blame. If getting paid no longer feels like progress, it may not be because you're careless, ungrateful, or bad at adulthood. It may be because your effort is being consumed by a version of normal life that demands constant maintenance while giving almost no emotional proof that maintenance is becoming movement. That realization changes the texture of everything. A month no longer feels like a reset. Work no longer feels automatically connected to forward motion. Time becomes harder to trust. Even responsibility begins to feel heavier from the inside. And once you see that clearly, a lot of shame stops making sense. Because now the question is no longer, why am I not more grateful? The question becomes, how long have I been calling survival progress just because survival was the only thing my effort could afford to create? That is a brutal question, but it is also a clarifying one, because the moment you see the difference between continuation and movement, you stop confusing exhaustion with weakness. You stop treating your frustration like a character flaw. You stop acting as if the absence of emotional reward means the effort was not real. You stop blaming yourself for not feeling fulfilled by a cycle that was never designed to feel fulfilling in the first place. And maybe that is the most honest thing to say about all of this. The real pain is not just that money comes in and goes out. The real pain is that your labor can keep your life functioning for years while never giving you the internal feeling that your life is actually becoming more yours. That is why this feels so heavy. Not because you're failing to move, but because you've spent too long inside a form of adulthood where motion is required, effort is constant, time keeps passing, and almost none of it returns as felt progress. So, if payday has started to feel emotionally flat, do not rush to translate that into ingratitude, and do not rush to call your exhaustion weakness. Sometimes the most accurate explanation is the hardest one. You are not broken because maintenance no longer feels like progress. You are tired because some part of you still knows the difference between repetition and a life that is actually moving.